listening to Smash the Bug podcast. I'm your host, Joseph Maxwell, and I am super excited about our guest on the podcast today, particularly because we're going to be talking about some things, kind of bringing some fresh perspectives into the e-commerce developer conversation. If you haven't already, make sure to subscribe to our podcast. You'll find it on the Swift Otter channel on YouTube. You'll find it as Smash the Bug podcast on all of the great podcast syndication platforms like Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, and a couple. And Stitcher. Stitcher is the other one I was missing there. So I would love to introduce to you our guest here today, Oscar Merida, from the editor-in-chief and owner of PHP Architect. Now, they produce a magazine specifically geared for the PHP language. And obviously they cover a lot of different aspects of this, but this is an outstanding resource to broaden your horizons as you build applications in Magento or WooCommerce or whatever you're building on. You now have extra information as far as what's available in the ecosystem, and this is incredibly valuable. We'll be talking about this here through this podcast, but you might find that you're not using all the features that are available in PHP. And I'm super excited to talk to Oscar today about this because it's such an important issue. We are missing out on productivity. So welcome, Oscar. It's great having you on here.
Hi, thanks for having me. I'm glad to be here.
Awesome.
Some PHP.
Yes, definitely. So what do you do? I know I said your title was the editor-in-chief and owner of PHP Architect. What a wonderful magazine it is. What would you say you do? Can you put that into some developer terms, if you will?
Sure. For PHP Architect, I manage the whole production of the magazine each month and also a line of books that we produce. I have a couple in the works. We have a really old Magento 1 book that still is available. Okay. If anyone is still stuck on Magento 1. So that's a lot of non-coding stuff, although I've used code to automate some of the pain points away. But, nice. That's wrangling people to write, like I reached out to you.
Yep.
And then working with them on their manuscript, drafting things, revising things, all the way through layout of each issue.
That's really cool. That's cool. That's a lot of effort, a lot of work. I've done a little bit of that type of work, and I know just how much effort it takes. And so thank you on behalf of the community for your hard work on that.
You're welcome.
It's a valuable resource. I know that. So one of the things we're going to talk about today is we could put this as the title of maybe the whole podcast. We'll see how much time we get into, shooting for like 20, 30 minutes here. But sure. What would be the most unused features that you see in PHP that just overall that you're getting to dig into someone's code base and you're like, I know about this feature, but why aren't they using this? This is such a cool part of the language.
In terms of actual like language syntax, I really like PHP's functional array support. So there's a whole suite of functions that all start with array underscore, array map, array filter, array search, that can let you look through an array and manipulate it without having to do all the boilerplate syntax of, looping through it and working with it sequentially that way. Instead, you use like a callable or a function. A typical example is like if you want to array filter is great because if you just give it an array, it'll by default filter out anything that's empty.
So yeah, that's really good.
To get rid of.
See, there's a trick right there. Line. Absolutely.
Yeah.
That's a great trick. Like just pass it in there like that. And one thing I like about those the array functions is you can actually, since it accepts a callable, so you can just pass in function. Right. Two things, you can type hint that, right? So you can type hint it with an existing class, or you can also use that you can pass a callable in. So like you could have a method that accepts a callable, and you can swap out what happens inside that array filter as if it's part of some other logic, and it makes it really powerful as opposed to, I guess you could do that with a for each, but I don't know, it's just not quite as intuitive.
Yeah, it's not quite as intuitive. You're in danger of like polluting the global scope or the local scope with other variables that may not need to like live outside of it. So that's usually why I like putting stuff into a callable or calling a method that's elsewhere for those reasons. That's
an interesting point. I had not thought of like the scoping, because ultimately, yeah, if you get a long method, you could, I guess you could just be careful, but you're wrangling more variables than necessary, and that's where problems start tending to come in.
Yeah, I guess I ran into a lot of places where I would be looping through things, and then you'd have like a count or a sum variable or something that's keeping track of something.
Yeah.
And if you reuse that one later, or if you get to reset it or initialize it earlier between loops, you get really weird bugs that are annoying to track down.
Yes. Which reminds me, the like the Laravel, like the collections, those are those kind of add on to all this, and there's 50 or 100, I can't remember. It's like a massive number of those really powerful methods, and I sure wish they were in other languages, platforms like Magento, or I don't know what WordPress has in that way, but yeah, those.
Yeah, those are next level approaches to it. But I think the way it's built, aren't those part of like the Illuminate namespace? So in theory, you could just pull out the collections and use them elsewhere with Composer.
Yeah, that would be really cool. Actually, that would be a project I should see about undertaking, bringing that into Magento. I love that. It's really powerful. Do you ever have pushback or concern from people? Because, let me just put it this way. One of the biggest concerns I've heard with people advocating, using these array functions is, what about performance, right? I mean, for each is about as fast as you could possibly get. And by the time you get into array map, array filter, whatever, or array walk, I guess, you lose a little bit of performance. Do you ever, do you think that's an issue?
I don't think it's an issue because for PHP to be the bottleneck, you have to be working with a huge amount of data. And maybe for an e-commerce shop, that is typical if you have very complicated objects or a lot of them. But even for like a couple thousand or tens of thousands of things, I've never noticed that, after profiling, that the array functions are what's causing a slowdown. And I would tend to guess that they are not slow because they're using C code, right, to loop internally. Internally, the PHP interpreter is still looping through your array for you, but it's doing that inside of C. So I think that might actually be faster in some cases. The one you have to be careful with is array shift. So when you pull stuff off the front of an array, it causes the array to be re-indexed. So if you have a lot of things in your array, that can add up really quick to hurt your performance.
Well, that is a good note. Now, is there a way to remove an item from the beginning, the zero index in an array, without causing everything to be re-indexed? Do you know?
I don't think so.
I was going to say, that question was coming, didn't you?
You'd have to, I think, I was actually looking at this yesterday because I did use these to do something. I think you'd have to trick it. You could use array reverse to flip the whole array and then pop stuff off the top or the end.
There we go. Okay.
And then that doesn't get re-indexed. But I don't know how expensive array reverse is, or at what point the cost benefit is worth it.
Okay. Well, that's good. Yeah, that's really good. It's those little gotchas that as we're writing code that ultimately end up adding up quite significantly. And I think it's less of whether we use for each or array walk or array map or that sort of thing. It's less of that probably than it is, for example, in Magento terms, which I'm very familiar with, using a repository to load a list of products, and a repository, I mean, I can hardly put into words how horrible for performance that is. Right. So, that's like the big elephant, whereas, using some of these is greatly enhances the developer experience, but the difference in performance is like ant size comparatively, to the big elephant of loading via a repository, for example.
Right. And when you're working with big collections of things, you're more likely to run out of memory before you're going to run out of like execution time or CPU. Yes. So I tend to, you shouldn't prematurely optimize things, but if I know I'm going to be working with a huge collection of things, I'll try to do something like use a generator or something that walks through a big collection of things without loading like all 10,000 of them into memory first, which is what some naive implementations for collections and record sets tend to do.
This is good. So I should stop you there. And this word generator. I know this was not in the notes, but I'm coming from a developer community that there's probably a good number that have never touched or used a generator in their development career. So maybe you can walk me through, what does a generator do?
Oh boy. Okay. Well, I don't think they're peculiar to PHP. I think generators are found in other languages, and as usual, PHP found it useful and added it in, I think,
Yes,
pretty late in 5.6 or 5.7 around then. But we're all familiar with a typical function. You'll call it with some inputs, and it'll return a value. And then if you need to call that function again, you would do that in a loop somewhere else, pass it a new thing in, and iterate that way. What a generator does, and I'm basically talking from a more practical sense of how I use them and understand them to work than from any theory.
That's
so
good.
The way I think about them is you call a function still, and instead of returning something, it uses the keyword yield. And what that will do is it'll kind of pause execution inside of that function and yield that value back out to you. But next time you call that function, it can yield a new value for you. So it's in some ways, it's a different way to loop through things or get a collection of values. A typical example for like a basic generator is calculating Fibonacci numbers. That's a good example. Everyone understands how you calculate one. Like you add the current value to the previous one to get the next one,
right?
And so on and so on. So you can do that in a loop. You could also just do that in a function that in the function scope will keep track of what those current and next values are to generate the third value. And then every time you call it, you'll get the next value in the sequence without explicitly writing a loop. So I should have looked this up, but if anyone is not a PHP Architect subscriber, there is an article on generators it's probably a couple of years back now that goes really in depth into them.
That's great. Yeah, it's a really powerful. And I don't find that we would reach for it all the time, like in every single case that we're like doing a loop or returning values from a database. But there are those times it's really, really helpful, and especially for performance sake, being able to load. Well, for example, like if you, I'm just throwing out an example here. Like if we had let's say for the sake of memory, I'm about to start on a project that is almost this specifically right here. That is basically, we have values spread across multiple, it's like a CSV file, but we've broken it up into chunks. I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, we could use a generator. We just iterate 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then maybe the next file starts at 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and we can make it a seamless iteration through all 5 files or however many files contain values, and it becomes a seamless transition. So instead of loading one big CSV that's, a megabyte or more megabytes of file size, we can break it into small chunks and only render and parse those individual CSV files at a time.
Yeah, that's a good example. Working with files is a great use of generators, or working with APIs. If you have to hit an API a lot, those are good. Generators are also useful where if you're in your example of working with multiple CSV files, if you have to combine data across those like 3 different CSV files into one thing that the rest of your code needs to work on, you could do that in a generator.
Yes.
You loop, grab a line from each one of those, transform it however you need to, yield that new transform value. Next time your code needs the next thing in the set, it would call your function. You would read the second line and across all those files, put things together, how the code expects it, and send it back.
That's great. That's great. And like you said, every time we call this function, it returns it returns the next value. So for example, I assume we can use that like in a for each loop. So we'd say for each and then like get next row and then whatever, and then it's just going to return whatever the yield statement calls out.
Right. And then once that for each loop, or if you have it in a while or some other way, eventually you might want to stop yielding numbers. And then so you'd have some logic around when do you stop yielding stuff and either just terminate or return a final value.
And that return that final value is through the return statement, right? So you have both a yield and a return in a method.
You can. Yep.
Okay. Yeah. Well, that's good. Yeah. I'm glad. Yeah. So we talked about the array functions, which is really powerful. And then we talk about generators, and generators are really, really powerful for performance optimization, and making sure, again, like this project we're about to embark on, we are going to be loading in significant amounts of data, processing it, and pushing it into Magento as orders, and a whole bunch of other related information. But generators would be an excellent option there. So that was good. This was great. So we've talked about two different ideas that are often missed. What about something else?
Well, I'll give you a non-code one that I find really useful.
Okay,
is the built-in development web server that's been part of PHP since 5.4, 5.6. So it makes it real easy to just stand up a website, local one that you can hack on without having to go through and set up Apache or Docker stuff or XAMPP. If you run PHP-S and bind it to some ports, I'm not going to get the syntax right off the top of my head. You can then hit that URL in your browser, and it'll run whatever code is in that same directory.
That's cool.
As where you ran that command. I used it on a client project that ran on Windows, and I didn't want to run Docker or VirtualBox or Vagrant on Windows.
WSL.
It'd be slow. Yeah. This was before WSL. WSL is great though.
Yeah.
So I just used that as my web server, and I had SQL Server running because that was a database backend. And in just less than an hour of work, I had a working dev environment to hack on this project.
That's so cool.
Without going through the usual steps of configuring a million different things. Really good.
It's a pain. Setting up a dev environment can be a real pain, and having just a really quick, dirty way to fire up PHP and get it running, that could be really powerful. That's cool. I like that.
Yeah. I think both WordPress and Drupal have how-to guides to use that for a quick and dirty dev environment when you need to prototype something or just get something running real quick. Nice.
I assume there wouldn't be any problems with connecting to MySQL or anything else, right? I mean, it's just a connection that it's going to make regardless. So yeah,
right.
That's really cool. Yeah, just be able to spin that up, get in there and get working with it. Yeah, again, that is a very common problem that I hear is it's a pain to set up a development environment for a new website or new project, and being able just to get in there is super cool.
And it's more painful when you have to share that dev environment with a team.
Yeah, that's for sure too. Absolutely. Yeah, I get it. And so you had one other thing mentioned here.
This is a real deep cut, I think. The SPL, which is been in PHP for a long time. I think it came in one of the very early versions of 5, like 5.1. So we're talking about 15 years old. The SPL library is the oddly named standard PHP library. And what it tried to do and does
like for your information, for your FYI,
right.
For your FYI, yeah.
ATM machine is another good one.
Yeah, there you go.
I like to use it because it puts an OO, object-oriented interface to working with files. So if you ever have to work with files, there's a bunch of procedural functions in PHP where you can you file open, get a handle, and then use file read to read lines, and then have to remember to close your line. There's fgets CSV, I think, but that will automatically parse CSV files for you. What SPL does is you can actually have an SPL file object and give it a path, and then work with it by calling similarly named methods to get a line from it, to open it, to close it, read it, write it, all that sort of stuff. And you don't have to track all those internal resources like a file handle in your code. So I use it a lot for parsing CSV files when I have to. It's very more readable. The SPL also provides a bunch of more useful exceptions that you can use in your code to not just throw you a generic exception. If you encounter an invalid argument, it provides an invalid argument exception and unexpected out of range exceptions and all sorts of other stuff. There's also a bunch of data structures that are in it. So if you need to tune how an array-like thing works, it's got an array class that it's not an actual array, but it works like an array. But there are some that can be tuned from memory. Let me look it up real quick.
The array iterator, I think.
Not just the iterator. It's like the SPL fixed array is something that works like an array, but it's a fixed size, so that's good for memory. If you need a heap or a queue or a stack, those more computer sciencey data structures that have their place in code.
Oh, that's cool.
Instead of implementing your own, you can use the ones that come with this. There's even a doubly linked list. Another one.
Because Yeah, and specifically, very practically speaking, we talk about the files, and I can raise my hand and say that I've used. I think I have, unless I use the parsing library because if I use fget CSV, I have to try to manually assign the headers to the rows, and I don't like to do that. I feel like that's ridiculous. So I used it was the parse CSV library. I can't remember what library it was. I reached for recently, but do you know how that works with importing a CSV using SPL structures? Does it assign the headers out to the values, like kind of build that array structure for you? Is that still something you have to do?
No, I think that's still something you have to do. What the SPL file class basically does is put a object-oriented wrapper around all those functions.
Nice.
To like get like a file size, check if it exists, those sorts of things.
Nice. Well, it's really good because I think, correct me if I'm wrong, I would consider myself no expert on file system and how that interacts with PHP in the slightest. I would put myself at probably fairly beginner level there. You can start running into some really crazy errors dealing with files, right? If you use fget CSV and file open or f open and f close, that sort of thing. If you forget to call the f close, or if you run into an exception between f open and f close, and f close doesn't get called, you start running some weird stuff. Isn't that right?
Yeah. Okay. Not closing your file handles can lead to weird things, because if you're using locks or somehow locking a file, you might make it so that other processes can't read or write to it. And I think because the SPL file object is an actual object, when PHP finishes a script, it'll call the destruct magic method on it. So it should automatically close things for you, even if you forget to do so.
Nice. Okay. That makes sense. Yeah. So that's a huge performance boost right there, at least from developer productivity standpoint, because we're able to focus on what we're doing as opposed to worrying about those nitty gritty details. And I guess if we are using fopen, just make sure to have that in a finally clause. So try finally to make sure that f close gets hit appropriately. That's good. Yeah, cool. So this is great. The next question I want to talk about, we have just a few minutes left, is the best resources out there for PHP. Again, I talk about this in the Art of eCommerce debugging book, but I shared this story with you. But that was PHP Tech 2016. It was there. It was such a great conference. Some really good stuff there. And I remember PHP Jeopardy. So you get up there and there were 3 people from the Magento community that were there, and I'm not picking on them at all in the slightest, but it illustrated a huge point for me, because they got the lowest points of the whole PHP Jeopardy game, and there's some really bright PHP bulbs up there on the stage too, so maybe it wasn't 100% fair.
It probably wasn't a fair field.
But regardless, there was a lot of, I would say, even somewhat common PHP knowledge that was fairly missing. And what I think we can get into as e-commerce developers, we get into these rabbit holes of we know what the platform requires from us, but it's hard for us to break out of that, to look outside of that, to look at a different platform, to look at a whatever it is. So you being in very much the PHP education world, you've educated thousands and thousands of developers worldwide. What would you say would be the best resources for PHP? And I'm fully expecting you to say PHP architect, and I welcome that. Sure. But I want to hear from you, what are, for people who are pigeonholed, rabbit holed, whatever you want to call it, into this platform, only what this platform requires you to know, how should they expand out to understand these other features or ideas that kind of keep coming into the community? Sure.
I think from a practical day-to-day usefulness, the online docs for PHP at php.net are really useful, and they're a good way to dip your toe in the language. So, because you're going to run across, what is this function? Where is it coming from? Like array search or array map, or sort. There's a sort function in PHP. If you run across your code and want to know how it works or how to call it, if you just go over to php.net/ and put a function name, it'll generally land you on that definition. And the comments are great for showing gotchas, how to do it, how That
Yeah,
function
yeah.
may have evolved
Yeah.
over time. So that's great if you know what you're looking for. And it's not just good for functions. If you know, like you're working with MySQL, the PDO documentation for working with databases would be a good step to seeing how you prepare a query and work with the result set and all that stuff.
Well, if I could just drop this in there, I love your comment about the PDO because, well, basically that's how you interact with the database. But so many of us with the platforms we're working on, it's so far abstracted from, I mean, we're using these doctrine or we're using some type of system that we don't have to almost ever touch queries, but still getting down into the weeds of understanding how this connects to the database. That's really valuable for troubleshooting those really difficult errors we're probably going to come across at some point in our career.
Right. Yeah. It is great when you get that an odd error message and you put it into Google and it leads you to either Stack Overflow or the documentation because it's been listed there.
Yes.
A better guide if you're trying to get out into the PHP wider world is PHP the Right Way. And I believe
there you go. That's
PHPtherightway.com.
Yep.
Because that's not just here's the syntax, here's what a variable is. It's really advice on how to work with databases, how to write secure code.
Yeah.
A little bit, I think, how to work with objects and stuff. So it has all these concepts nicely broken out into digestible chunks that you can read through and then hopefully start implementing some of those things.
I love that. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Wow. Who introduced me to that was our local Kansas City PHP user group, and they talked a lot about volunteering there, and I think it was definitely weaved into some of those conversations, and I've always been very impressed. It's like that resource that we need for kind of that foundation of decent decent PHP development. Like it's I think we could say all or almost all decent PHP developers would agree this is the foundation. I mean, like it's basic, but it's really informative. It's really good knowledge that pretty much everyone's going to have if they're in PHP and are doing decent work.
Right, and I think it came about in response to a lot of critiques of PHP, and especially like really old PHP tutorials that are still floating around out there that aren't necessarily going to show you the right way to store passwords or talk to a database and avoid SQL injection. So it was really an effort by a bunch of folks, I forget who exactly, to say, like, what's the right way to handle securely storing passwords? What's the right way to avoid SQL injection when you're working with a database? What kind of things do you have to worry about when you're outputting HTML code? And all those subjects in one place to hopefully win the SEO battle against all the bad tutorials that are out there.
Oh yeah, definitely.
You brought up your user group, and that's on my list too. A great resource is your local user group, whether it's a PHP-specific one or a Magento, Drupal, or just generic web development one. They're great places to go and get exposed to things you might not know you need to know about or are coming down the pike.
Or what really helped me out as well, so in addition, I guess, is speaking at those. Like, obviously, you don't want to just go in and ask to speak the first time, but like that really helped me shape a lot of the talks I was giving. I remember I previewed the talk I think I gave at PHP Tech. Did I give a talk at PHP? I can't remember. Maybe I think I did. Yeah, about PHP 7. I previewed that at there, and I got their feedback. It was really good feedback, and it helps get you out of your comfort zone. It is so good. Like, just the interactions, listening to other people's talks. If you want to get up the gumption to your talk yourself, it is so good. Like I have such good memories of that time when, unfortunately, that was a casualty of COVID. But they're doing it virtually, but I hate to say it's just not the same.
It's not quite the same. There's a bunch of other virtual groups for PHP that you can find. php.ug will help you find a local one. That's a website that literally maps them all out. I think it's built on top of, I don't think Google, but one of those. So you can find a local one.
What was the one Cal Evans puts together, or at least they used to do that, but it was like a virtual thing that you had a really good speaker every month. What was that? Man.
That's Nomad PHP.
Nomad, there you go. That was, we watched one or two of those sessions in the, I think we did, in our user group, and those are really good too. Are they still doing that?
Yeah, they're still doing that.
Right. Okay.
He also used to do summits every like quarter or every couple months, but I don't know if he's still doing that. And I'm day camp for devs.
That's right. Yes. Yeah. So this next one is coming up on May 27th, which is, so it'll be, by the time this gets published, it'll be already done, but it's really cool. Artificial intelligence so yeah, I don't know how it specifically relates to PHP, if he's actually talking about implementing AI or algorithms in PHP. Either way, it's good. Like that's broadening our horizons in this stuff. So this is good stuff to get out there to learn new things. So again, Nomad PHP as well. Great resource.
Yeah, and despite their names, both Lyricasts and Symphony, what's Symphony's video tutorial platform called? They both have a lot of foundational, just broad, how do you work with objects?
Symphony casts?
Symphony casts.
Yeah. Yes. Well, and last but not least, we definitely need to hear a shameless plug because...
Sure. I know a lot of folks they prefer reading or to complement video. So PHP Architect, the magazine, I try each month to put together things that are relevant new developments coming down the pike. Like we'll have what's new in PHP 1 issue in a couple months. And not just PHP topics. We've done stuff like how's your browser render HTML? What's new in JavaScript? What are some browser APIs that you may not know about that you could use? And DevOpsy stuff. Joe Ferguson's been doing a deep dive into Whistle and how you get it to work nicely for a dev environment on Windows. That's actually Linux under the hood. So a broad range of topics from basic, like how does PHP do things? How do you work with object-oriented stuff to ancillary stuff around DevOps and other technologies. So that's a good monthly way to... what I try to do is curate stuff so that you can trust the stuff in there versus where am I going to go? If I go search for something, how do I know it's good quality?
Absolutely.
Relevant and up to date. Yeah,
and that's a really good thing because, again, I just see over and over again, like you mentioned earlier, there's tons of information out there, but the question is, can I trust this? Is this good information or is this not good information? And so having that relevant, and the thing like with the magazine is it comes to you every month, right? So it's not something that you have to, it's like, okay, I'm going to sit down on my computer, I'm going to take a few minutes and I'm going to learn more about PHP. Like, okay, then the question is, well, what am I going to learn? Where am I going to go? But this is delivered to you in written form. So, let's just say there's times, several times, maybe every day that I have some sitting time. And it's great reading material at that point, or whatever downtime. I mean, we always have downtime. And so having that magazine, I highly recommend it. I've loved the issues that I've read of it as myself, and so great way to branch out to see the bigger picture of the community, learn new topics that maybe we're not necessarily dealing with on a daily basis, but we might deal with those in the future.
Right. That's the thing. You got to be prepared for things you may not know you're going to need to know.
100%. Yes, absolutely. Well, this has been great, Oscar.
Let me mention one more thing. Another thing I've added is the PHP Architect. For subscribers, I have a Discord now. So if you subscribe, there's a Discord. You get a link when you log into your dashboard. And it's a real friendly, helpful place where if you're stuck on something or a couple times a month, I'll see a question like, hey, does anyone need to... What's the best way to generate PDFs with PHP? Or I can't get Docker to work over here. Has anyone run into this issue? And people will jump in and help out and share their experiences and hopefully lead you to a fix.
Cool. I love that. Yeah, absolutely. That's great. That's a great value add there. And again, nothing against Stack Overflow, but it's I don't know. I can't feel like its value has been lost in the last few years, especially like. Some of the answers on there just are not that great anymore. And it really is, especially for someone who's starting out, it's very difficult to decipher, is this legit? Is this bad? Like, what's wrong with it? How would I fix it? That sort of thing, as opposed to going to a place where there's some really sharp people involved and they're willing to help you out. And that's a wonderful thing.
It is.
Very cool. Well, excellent, Oscar. Listen, it's been a pleasure having you on here. Thank you for sharing your knowledge and especially I love the inspiration towards these new, or not new, these features, like you said, some of them have been in there for 15 years, and probably there's probably a good number of us that have never touched this. I think I've used SPL, but it is definitely not a regular part of my toolbox. And so this reminder, this introduction, whatever it is, to these aspects of the platform, of the language, is really helpful. So thank you for sharing that on. And everyone those of you who are listening to this, make sure to go to PHP Architect. I highly recommend the subscription. I have very much appreciated those magazines myself. They have some great content, great material there. It's investing in yourself, your future, your knowledge. So it's not, I don't consider this as an expense that's an expense. This is an investment. Except I think the investment you would probably make if you calculated it out, kind of ran the numbers, you probably would get way more than a 10 or even 20% return on investment. I'm guessing would be hundreds of percent return on investment if you were able to, really calculate it out correctly. So it's a very good investment in your career as you look to broaden out and understand how the stuff works together. So this was a great episode. I was really excited to be able to sit down with Oscar. Again, kind of outside of our normal community, but brings a new, fresh perspective in, which we always need. So if you haven't already, make sure to subscribe on our YouTube Swift Otter channel, or Smash the Bug podcast on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, or Spotify. We are there. So thank you for listening. It was been a pleasure spending this time with you.